to see so many fantastic faces smiling out at the out of the computer at me. It really is lovely to speak to you all. Now, just quickly to introduce myself to you, and also to let you know a little bit about who I am and how I've approached this talk to you this evening. I'm an actress. So it's important to remember all the way through whilst I'm speaking to you that I'm an actress, not an academic. I've worked at Mary Arden's farm as a period interpreter, they call them. And so I was a Tudor, so Mistress Rosie, for an entire season, and discovered a very, very random ability at being able to milk cows. Now, as a townie, that came as quite a surprise, but I had an absolutely fantastic summer living and very much smelling like a Shakespearean. Then I moved to Shakespeare's birthplace and joined their acting company, Shakespeare Aloud. And there we performed Shakespeare on request. So that means, as an actor, you need to know something from every single one of Shakespeare's plays. And that is no exaggeration, because people try and trick you and they try and catch you out, and they'll ask you for all sorts of things. So for several years, I learnt and performed Shakespeare's plays. And through that time, learnt to recognise his voice, his unique voice. And every now and again, you would be performing a piece or reading a piece, and you'd very definitely know that that wasn't Shakespeare who was talking through the characters. Then I started to work more with the education department at the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, and also then moved to work in education at the RSC when following a car accident, when I was unable to work on the stage. And during that time, I spent a lot of time researching Shakespeare. So I have lived, breathed, slept, and ate kind of Shakespearean. But it's as an actress. It's from the moment that I walked into the rehearsal room in Putney in 2002 to start rehearsing As You Like It, the full first folio edition of As You Like It. We performed for 5 months that summer. That's when I started to love Shakespeare and to be absolutely fascinated by not just the man, but also his stories. And it's from that point of view that I'm talking to you tonight. Now, for those of you who've heard me before, you'll recognise this. Oh, for a muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention, a kingdom for a stage, princes to act, and monarchs to behold the swelling scene. Then should the warlike Harry, like himself, assume the port of Mars, and at his heels, leashed in like hounds, should famine, sword, and fire crouch for employment. Once more unto the breach, dear friends, once more. There we go. I think that's unmuted me. So it's earthy and it's physical and it's muddy, but it's also very, very blokey. And as an actress, quite often I hear other actresses groaning and moaning about the fact that there aren't enough really great characters for women to play. And so that's when I started to look at well, Shakespeare's women. And there hasn't really been very much study on Shakespeare's women. Carol Rutter wrote a book entitled Clamorous Voices, and Penny Gay wrote a book called As She Likes It, Shakespeare's Unruly Women. Now, they to me don't sound like particularly flattering titles. They don't really give us women any good crit. Tina Packer, who's an absolutely fantastic actress, she worked extensively with the Royal Shakespeare Company and became an associate member. She now works in Massachusetts in America, where she was a founder, artistic director of Shakespeare and Company. And she studied, performed, and then wrote a book entitled Women of Will. And she suggests that Shakespeare's women, and he presented his women in very, very different ways as he moved through his career. So he started with women who were perhaps caricatures, such as the Shrew, women who needed to be tamed, or alternatively, women who were incredibly subservient. And then he ended with characters who were much more fleshed out, like Viola and Portia, for example. But that perhaps is a little bit convenient when you think about Shakespeare's background. Why on earth would he need to spend the entirety of his career learning about women when he in fact grew up surrounded by them? Shakespeare's mum was called Mary Arden. Now, she was the youngest of 8, and yet she was left money and property by her father and was the executrix of his will. Now, that suggests that she, Mary Arden, Shakespeare's mum, could read and write. And she married John Shakespeare, Shakespeare's dad, after her father died, which then also suggests that perhaps she chose her husband. Now, Mary was brought up in the countryside on a farm in Wilmcote, and that's where I worked and smelt like a Tudor. And it's suggested that William spent some time there when he was young and as a baby to escape the outbreaks of the plague that were experienced in Stratford. And it certainly sounds like he has a great fondness for the countryside. Take, for example, this extract from As You Like It. Now, my co-mates and brothers in exile, hath not old custom made this life more sweet than that of painted pomp? Are not these woods more free from peril than the envious court? Here feel we not the penalty of Adam, the season's difference, as the icy fang and churlish chiding of the winter's wind, which when it bites and blows upon my body, even till I shrink with cold, I smile and say, this is no flattery. These are counsellors that feelingly persuade me what I am. Sweet are the uses of adversity, which, like the toad, ugly and venomous, wears yet a precious jewel in his head. And this our life, exempt from public haunt, finds tongues in trees, books in the running brooks, sermons in stone, and goods in everything. I would not change it. And in this play, Shakespeare spends a long time comparing the court with the countryside. And Corin, one of the shepherds, has quite an extensive discussion with Touchstone the clown about how ridiculous the manners of the court are in the countryside. And as I experienced at Mary Arden's farm, you certainly get pretty mucky when you're dealing with the husbandry of animals. And on one particular occasion, when I was milking my cow, she swung her tail. And for the rest of the day, I was followed by quite a large cloud of flies. And it wasn't until the end of the day that my lovely colleagues explained to me that when the cow had swung her tail, what had happened, well, there was a great big line of poo that went from the top of my coif down to the bottom of my dress. And that was why the flies were following me, because, well, I smelt pretty bad for the entirety of the day. And Corin talks about how ridiculous it would be to kiss hands in the countryside because, of course, their hands are covered with, well, I don't think I need to go into any more detail. And Shakespeare certainly knew about his fruit. He mentions, for example, pippins, codlings, crab apples, custards, apple john, bitter sweetlings, and leathercoats. And as for flowers, well, the list goes on. Primroses, oxlips, violets, pansies, daisies, marigolds, columbines, lilies, woodbine, and daffodils, to name but a few. But what else did he get from his mum? Not just this experience of the countryside, but also women. Loads of them. He was surrounded by them because in the Tudor times, every time a woman had a child, well, all of her sisters and aunties came over and they all celebrated the event. And Mary, well, she had 8. And so quite often the house would have been filled with these women. He had 6 aunties because unfortunately, one of his aunties died. So as a child, the female influence would have been really strong. Well, I've got 2 sisters, and we are incredibly different. So he would have experienced all sorts. And in those early plays, there is a huge difference and variation of women. Yes, there's Catharina the Shrew. Perhaps we could box her away in terms of that kind of caricature. But there's also Tamora in Titus Andronicus, that fantastic play where she indeed ends up eating her own sons cooked in a pie. Oh, fantastic. She seeks revenge on Titus for the death of those sons. Then there's the princess in Love's Labour's Lost, who's happy to take part in what we nowadays might call banter. And she certainly comes out on top, as women do throughout the whole of the play. And a short time later, he then creates Titania, Helena, Hermia, Juliet, this huge different variety of women that no doubt he would have come across in the variety of all of these aunties that he had and all of these women that came clamoring into his house. And Mary would have run the household because John Shakespeare had a thriving business. He was a glove maker in Stratford-upon-Avon, and he also was the High Bailiff or the mayor. So Mary would have run the household, and it was her job to organise the feeding of the entire household because that was part of your wages at the time. She would have had the keys to the spice chest, a great authority within the household. And she had to make sure that all of the day labourers that came to work were well fed and well looked after, because if they weren't, well, they simply wouldn't come to work the next day. And so for her, that's a partnership in John Shakespeare's business. And so we look at these girls, Titania, Helena, Hermia, Juliet, and wonder what it was that Shakespeare might have experienced from them, not just through the joys or the horrors of childbirth, but also from a female's life experience. Now, I'm sure many of us have heard in a school playground one of our girlfriends grumbling on about, well, her prettier friend getting all of the boys. How happy some or other some may be. Through Athens, I am thought as fair as she. But what of that? Demetrius thinks not so. He will not know but all that he do know. And as he errs, doting on Hermia's eyes, so I, admiring of his qualities, things base and vile, holding no quantity, love can transpose to form and dignity. Love looks not with the eyes, but with the mind, and therefore is winged Cupid painted blind. For ere Demetrius looked on Hermia's eyne, he hailed down oaths that he was only mine. And when this hailsome heat from Hermia felt, so he dissolved, and showers of oaths did melt. I will go tell him of fair Hermia's flight, then to the wood will he tomorrow night pursue her. And for this intelligence, if I have thanks, it is a dear expense. But herein mean I, to enrich my pain, to have his sight thither and back again. I'm sure all of us have not only heard, but maybe some of us have kind of expressed that sort of thing in the playground as we start to realise that sometimes boys don't quite necessarily fancy us when we fancy them. And I'm certain it's probably sometimes the other way round as well. And speaking of well, Juliet, at Shakespeare's Birthplace Trust, as we performed on request every single day, we realised very quickly that the most requested piece of Shakespeare was Romeo and Juliet, and in particular, what everybody calls the balcony scene, although obviously there is no balcony in the Shakespearean text itself. And we started to wonder why. So back in 2015, myself and two male colleagues, we started editing the text down to 2 absolute spot-on hours. And we decided that what we would do is we would put on the play, because we really needed to find out what it was about this play that everybody kept requesting it. And we found that the play was actually really interesting, because the first half of it is all about Romeo. And my goodness, doesn't Romeo go on? And in actual fact, you can see this when we get to the end of the play, in that Romeo, he gets about 1.5 pages before he gets on with dying. Juliet gets about 4 or 5 lines. Here's something, stabs herself, boom, job done. However, the second half of the play principally deals with Juliet's relationship with her father. And it's really, really interesting to note that at the time Shakespeare was writing the play, Susanna, his own daughter, was about 11 or 12. Now, Juliet refuses to marry Paris, knowing that she's already married. And her dad says, "God's bread, it makes me mad. Day, night, hour, tide, time, work, play, alone, in company, still my care hath been to have her matched. And having now provided a gentleman of noble parentage, of fair domain, youthful and nobly trained, stuffed, as they say, with honourable parts, proportioned as one's thought would wish a man, and then to have a wretched, pulling fool, a whining mammet in her fortune's tender to answer, I'll not wed, I cannot love, I am too young, I pray you, pardon me. But as you will not wed, I'll pardon you. Graze where you will, you shall not house with me. Look to it, think on it. I do not use to jest. Thursday is near. Lay hand on heart, advise, and you be mine. I'll give you to my friend, and you be not. Hang, beg, starve, die in the streets, for by my soul I'll ne'er acknowledge thee. Nor what is mine shall never do thee good. Trust to it, bethink you, I'll not be forsworn. It's such a harsh speech, and really, really terrifying for both Julia and the audience, as we've been made part of her secret. She then turns to both her mum and the nurse, her confidant and co-conspirator, who both then let her down, leading to the inevitable tragic events of the play. But before we think of Shakespeare's daughters, what of his wife? Now, as everybody knows, there was a great scandal surrounding Shakespeare's marriage to Anne Hathaway, for she was 26 and he a mere 18. They had to get special marriage license and permission to be married, and many people think that that's because of Anne Hathaway's age. But in actual fact, it was because of Shakespeare's age, not Anne's. 26 is actually the average age for marriage in the Elizabethan times. The marriages of 12 and 13-year-olds, as we see in Romeo and Juliet, was sort of exclusively reserved for, well, for royalty and titled families. In Shakespeare's class, as a woman, you spent the majority of your late teens, your early adulthood, learning the skills that you need to become a housewife, whether it be through working at home and staying in your own home, or going to work in somebody else's household. And in actual fact, the best thing to do would be to learn how to make a very good cheese. Because whilst milkmaids were popular with the men, for they were fair of face, soft of hand, and had very strong arms, which I'm led to believe is what a gentleman likes, on the table of a worthy household, cheeses were prized. And therefore, if you could make a good cheese, you would probably get pretty good employment. So 26 was a fairly average age for a woman to be married. Now, she was the eldest, Anne Hathaway, of 7 children living out in Shottery. Her family were tenant farmers and had been in the area for a very long time, and therefore the Hathaways and the Shakespeare family's paths would inevitably have crossed. Now, Anne Hathaway gets really bad press, and it's because of Shakespeare's will. And in his will, he writes, "Unto my wife I give my second best bed." What a scandal! A second best bed? Well, why give your wife a second best bed when presumably you therefore have a first best bed in the household? But when you look at it in its context, what Shakespeare was doing is actually, well, it's actually a really kind and loving gesture, because in an Elizabeth in an Elizabethan household, your best bed was generally kept downstairs in the parlour. Now, beds were pretty expensive. Wood was an expensive commodity. So if you had a good bed, in the same way as nowadays, if you have a good car, you might wish for your neighbourhood to see that. It's a little bit like getting a Porsche and leaving the garage door open for everybody to see. So in Shakespeare's time, your best bed was put downstairs in the parlour, near to the window, so anybody walking by would be able to look in and go, well, haven't the Shakespeares gone up in the world? Look at their best bed. It was where your guests would stay. So in actual fact, Anne Shakespeare would probably never have spent a single night in the best bed. The parlour was where you entertained your guests. And if you can imagine what a tannery might have smelt like. Now, there's no evidence at Shakespeare's birthplace of there having been any tannery pits, but obviously bringing in leather that's been treated with both urine and also dog poo, you can imagine that the business end of the property would have been pretty smelly and not particularly attractive. So the guests would have been kept in the parlour. They would have been entertained there, they would have been fed there, and then they would have slept there. So that's what the best bed was for. In actual fact, the second best bed would have been the Shakespeare's marital bed, where they would have enjoyed each other's company, where they would have given birth to all of the children that the family had. It was also, I believe, the bed that belonged to the Hathaway family. So what Shakespeare was doing in his will was he was giving his wife their marital bed and a bed that belonged to the Hathaway family. So once you put it into its context, you kind of start to realise that giving her the second best bed is not quite the insult that we may perhaps presume it to be. And also, when we look at some of the sonnets, it might perhaps suggest to us that while Shakespeare spent an awful lot of time in London, he left his heart in Stratford. Sonnet 50. How heavy do I journey on the way, when what I seek, my weary travels end, doth teach that ease and that repose to say, thus far the miles are measured from thy friend. The beast that bears me, tired with my woe, plods dully on, to bear that weight in me, as if by some instinct the wretch did know his rider loved not speed, being made from thee. The bloody spur cannot provoke him on, that sometimes anger thrusts into his hide, which heavily he answers with a groan, more sharp to me than spurring to his side. For that same groan doth put this in my mind, my grief lies onward, and my joy behind. It's a lovely thought, isn't it, that Shakespeare, every time he left home, kind of had to really spur his horse on to get him down to London. And you can see that Shakespeare doesn't buy any property at all down in London until the very end of his life. All of the property and all of the business interests that he had remain in Stratford upon Avon. And in Sonnet 116, he suggests that the marriage of true minds is the thing that keeps him going. Now, whether this marriage that he mentions is in the literal sense, we will never know. There have been plenty of suggestions of infidelity. The Earl of Southampton, who actually, he looked a little bit like me, apart from the fact that he had a moustache. He had this very long, curly blonde hair. And his mother was very concerned at one point that he wasn't getting married and producing an heir, at which point then Shakespeare, we see, writes an awful lot of sonnets describing the pleasure of having an heir. Now, it's interesting to note that there were very different ideas of love in Shakespeare's time. Whilst we see it purely as a relationship type thing, in Shakespeare's time, there was this idea of courtly love, of respect. And when we look at the Earl of Southampton, it's interesting to note that he was Shakespeare's patron. So he was paying Shakespeare money. So any reference to him in any way, shape or form is a very sensible thing for Shakespeare to do because, everyone likes a little bit of flattery now and again. There was also rumours of an innkeeper's wife. John Davenant and Jane Davenant lived in Oxford, and Shakespeare spent a lot of time in Oxford on his way down to London. Jane and John had a son. The son was called William. He eventually became Sir William Davenant, very high up in society and a poet. Now, for us looking back, we might think, that's convenient, isn't it? Shakespeare spent a lot of time with Jane in Oxford, and their son was called William. Curious. But in actual fact, Shakespeare, well, he was William's godfather, and in his time, generally, children were named after their godfathers. So whilst we could maybe draw some ideas from this situation, in practical terms, who knows? There's also the mysterious dark lady suggested to be Amelia Lanier. But again, it is to Anne that William returned home to New Place towards the end of his life, and it's Anne who continues to run the cottage industries from New Place after his death. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Oh no. It is an ever fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken. It is the star to every wandering bark, whose worth's unknown, although his height be taken. Love's not time's fool, though rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come. Love alters not with his brief hours and weeks, but bears it out, even to the edge of doom. If this be error, and upon me proved, I never writ, nor no man ever loved. What a lovely, lovely sentiment. And I know that Sonnet 116 is something that is often requested at many, many wedding ceremonies. So let's hope that that love between William and Anne sustained throughout their whole relationship. And so, on to Shakespeare's daughters. Now, Shakespeare had 3 children, Susanna, and then Judith and Hamnet. Hamnet died at the age of 11, presumably from a plague-related illness. Now, Susanna was born when William was just 18, and his younger brother, Edmund, was only 3. So we may perhaps start to think, well, maybe the 2 children shared some form of education, because we know that Susanna could write. And I know it because I've seen her signature, which was really, really, really exciting. And also her epitaph, it reads, "Witty above her sex, but that's not all. Wise to salvation was good Mistress Hall. Something of Shakespeare was in that, but this, wholly of him, with whom she's now in bliss." So we can presume that Susanna Hall, as she became, was a witty and wise woman. Now, she married John Hall, who practiced as a doctor, who had been to Cambridge University. She was accused of adultery by John Lane, who the Halls later sued for slander. And in The Winter's Tale, Hermione is accused of adultery by her husband Leontes, just after giving birth. She appears in court and speaks with incredible dignity. "Sir, spare your threats. The bug which you would fright me with, I seek. To me can life be no commodity. The crown and comfort of my life, your favour, I do give lost, for I do feel it gone, but know not how it went. My second joy, first fruits of my body, from his presence I am barred like one infectious. My third comfort, starred most unluckily, is from my breast, the innocent milk in its most innocent mouth hauled out to murder. Myself on every post proclaimed a strumpet. With a modest hatred the childbed privilege denies, which longs to women of all fashion. Lastly, hurried here, to this place in the open air before I have strength of limit? Now, my liege, tell me what blessings I have here alive, that I should fear to die. Therefore proceed. But yet, hear this, no life, I prize it not a straw, but for mine honour, which I would free. If I shall be condemned upon surmises, all proof sleeping else but which your jealousies awaken, I tell you 'tis rigour and not law. Your honours all, I do refer me to the oracle. Apollo be my judge. It is an incredible speech, and the second in the scene, the first where she describes her family and her lineage and the shock with which she received the accusations of her infidelity. It's an amazing scene, and shortly after she dies, only to return at the end of the play in the most magical, and some people say fantastical ending, but who cares? It's an incredible story. Now, Susanna inherited pretty much the whole of the Shakespeare estate, apart from a silver gilt bowl, which was given to Judith, and then £150, which was left to any child that Judith should have, Judith, the younger sister. Now, it would seem that Judith had a very different relationship with her father than that of Susanna. Judith married Thomas Quiney, and you can see where they lived in Stratford. It was Crabtree and Evelyn, should you ever go there, but I think now it's the Shakespeare distillery shop, right on the corner opposite Barclays Bank. Now, Thomas Quiney was a vintner. Now, he was named as the father of Margaret Wheeler's child just before he and Judith got married. And at that point, William Shakespeare rewrote his will. Now, sadly, both Margaret and his child died, saving the family from further embarrassment. And interestingly, in Othello, Amelia expresses an opinion on why women perhaps are unfaithful. But I do think it is their husbands' faults if wives do fall. Say that they slack their duties or pour our treasures into foreign laps, else break out in peevish jealousies, throwing restraint upon us. Or say they strike us and scant our former having in despite. Why, we have galls, and though we have some grace, yet have we some revenge. Let husbands know their wives have sense like them. They see and smell and have their palates both for sweet and sour as husbands have. What is it that they do when they change us for others? Is it sport? I think it is. And doth affection breed it? It is so too. And is frailty that thus errs? I think it doth. But have we not affections, desires for sports, and frailties as husbands have? Then let them use us well, else let them know the ills we do, their ills instruct us so. Oh, yes, what a fantastic speech. It's Shakespeare, a man, writing a speech for a female character played by a man, telling the audience, which would principally be made up of men, that if women are unfaithful to their husbands, it is the husband's fault. Yes, fantastic justification. Now, obviously, I am very happily married and wouldn't follow that advice, but oh my goodness, this is kind of 16th century feminism, more so than Viola or Portia or even Rosalind, and don't get me started on her. And unfaithful men, well, think of Falstaff and his treatment in the Merry Wives of Windsor. Now, Judith did name her first child Shakespeare, but unfortunately by then her father had died. In actual fact, all three of her children also died. Susanna had a daughter called Elizabeth, who eventually became Lady Elizabeth Barnard. She married twice, but to two much older gentlemen, and she didn't have any children. And so the direct line of William Shakespeare therefore died out. However, there is quite a lovely story, an anecdote which I will share with you from Stratford-upon-Avon, because although it's not the direct line of descendancy, there are still relations of William Shakespeare's living today, the majority of them in Canada. Now, Shakespeare's sister Joan, she married a hatter, and they had 4 children who had children who had children who had children who had children. And when I was working at Shakespeare's birthplace, we were visited by the Kirk family. Now, well, the Kirk family are absolutely amazing, and they currently live in Portugal. But they came to Stratford-upon-Avon because they had had a daughter, and they named her Susanna. And she is the 19th great niece of William Shakespeare. And they brought her to Stratford, and they put her in the cradle in the birth room where William would have been born. And we did a little bit of a performance for her. We sang a song and did a little bit of a speech from Henry VIII. And then we took her down, well, they took her, we went with them, to Holy Trinity Church, where she was baptized. It was an absolutely incredible occasion. I was there in full Elizabethan frockage in Holy Trinity Church, attending the baptism of Shakespeare's 19th great niece. Now, unfortunately, there were no members of her extended family there. So when it came to the baptism ceremony, well, those of us that were there had to sort of answer on their behalf. So in a way, I kind of feel that I'm a little bit of a godmother to the 19th great niece of William Shakespeare, which is a really rather lovely thing. Also, as it got later and later, I realised that actually the birthplace centre was closed, and that I was still in full Elizabethan frockery, and my car keys were about to be locked in the Shakespeare Centre, which was a couple of streets away. And so anybody sat in Stratford that evening would have had the vision of a woman in a red brocade frock belting through Stratford on her way back to get her car keys to drive home. And I'm still in contact with the Kirk family now. And that occasion was something that was really, really special. And so on to my relationship with Shakespeare, and why I kind of consider myself a little bit of one of Shakespeare's women. Because at one of the darkest times of my life, Shakespeare was there to comfort me in a really strange way. Now, as we're in lockdown, we all have experienced what it's like to be kind of trapped in your own homes. And 5 years ago, I was involved in a serious car accident where I fractured my spine, I fractured my sternum, I crushed my foot, and all of the other associated injuries that you might expect for a serious car collision. And so after being in hospital for 10 days, I then returned home. And once one of my friends had taken my children to school and my husband had left, the front door closed and I was trapped in my own home for several hours until they all came back home again. And that's incredibly difficult. And that's why I can relate to everybody who is struggling through this current lockdown situation. Now, I didn't want to become a television zombie. I absolutely refused to watch daytime television. And so what I did was I turned to Shakespeare. And I thought that it would be really, really interesting to edit Shakespeare's plays to just feature a single female character. Now, having just done 3 or 4 weeks previous, the 3-man version with 80 costume changes in 2 hours, might I add, of Romeo and Juliet, my first thought was perhaps to turn to Juliet, but at the time I wasn't really in the right state of mind to look at such, even though a tragic, a happy and love, young character. So the first character that I turned to was Lady Macbeth. And so I edited the script right down to just featuring Lady Macbeth. I added on a little bit of the 3 witches at the beginning, and also added on tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow at the end to bring it into a full story. And once I was satisfied with that text, I then moved on to Ophelia. And again, it was relatively easy with Ophelia to edit down the text to Hamlet to just feature Ophelia's lines. Then I looked at Rosalind. Now, Rosalind is really, really tricky because You kind of need an Orlando for Rosalind to bounce off. And so once I'd edited that down, I thought, well, what you could do is use that as perhaps a school text. So you take it into a school and get some of the students to read in the characters. That doesn't really feature just a single female voice. And then I looked at Cleopatra. And Cleopatra is absolutely impossible to turn into a one-woman show because she's reactive. Everything Cleopatra does is in response to somebody else. And so she doesn't really have a stream of consciousness or many speeches that you can turn into a sort of a performance until perhaps you get towards the end of the play. And so Lady Macbeth for me was the only complete script. And I sat on it and I looked at it and then I put it to the side. And I continued my struggle to get back to work, which is why I went to work at the RSC for a year, because I wasn't physically able to stand up on stage. And eventually, once I got myself fit and healthy again, I turned back to that script. And I spoke to one of the associate directors of the RSC, a fabulous director called Nikki Cox. And together we decided that it was the right time to put on the play. Now, it's too short to stand alone as a play, so we got together with another company who had done a play about Shakespeare and actors performing Shakespeare and made it a two-parter. So theirs went on first and then mine went on as the second act of the evening. And it was absolutely fascinating when Nikki and I did the first read-through to discover that even with the bolt on at the beginning of The Three Witches and the tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow speech bolted on at the end, the play was only 19 minutes long. Now, if you spoke to anybody in the world and asked them to name characters from Shakespeare's plays, you'd probably get Romeo and Juliet and maybe Falstaff, but inevitably you were going to get Lady Macbeth because of her famous out damn spot speech. So it's incredible when you look at the fact that this character gets less than 19 minutes of actual speech and yet has become one of the most iconic characters of Shakespeare. And that incredible imagery of her with the blood coming down off her hands. Now, coming from Shakespeare's birthplace, my ideas for the play were perhaps in traditional costume and a little bit dark and moody, whereas I got in the car one day with Nikki and I mentioned a kind of obsessive compulsive behaviour that I'd had as part of the post-traumatic issues that I was dealing with after the crash of having to say goodbye to my children in the morning, and that we had a sort of routine, and if that didn't happen, then that would make me very anxious. And it was from that momentary conversation and then the following car journey that our play began to take shape. And as an audience member, one of my dear friends, Kaz, she spoke to me after I'd done the play, and I was dressed only in a grey tracksuit, hair scraped back. We only had 3 chairs as the set, and they became the witches and Macbeth. The crown was torn out of paper. There was a party popper. There was red tissue paper. And then there was a pile of crowns or crumpled up paper at the back of the stage. And it was only when Kaz, as she was watching it, saw me scrumple up the crown and throw it over my shoulder to join all of the other crowns behind me, that she suddenly realised the true desperation and sadness of the play that we had put together. Because at that point, it then became obvious that this trauma that Lady Macbeth was going through was something that she relived again and again and again and again. We didn't ever say that she was in prison or in a mental institute, or whether she was locked inside her own head as she is stuck in purgatory. We didn't have to make any of those suggestions because the audience made them. And it's really fascinating that for me, having been through trauma, to then really dig into the mind of somebody who's suffered such incredible trauma and grief, that this really fascinating play came out of it, and that it became something that I never, ever expected from those very early times when I was sitting editing this play together. And so in a way, because I turned to Shakespeare at some of my darkest moments, I kind of feel that perhaps I can bracket myself in that incredible collection of people called Shakespeare's women. And so to finish, before we open up the floor to questions, I think it's really, really important that we turn to one of Shakespeare's women, to give us the final words. And when he shall die, take him and cut him out in little stars, and he will make the face of heaven so fine that all the world will be in love with night and pay no worship to the garish sun. And that's how I kind of imagine my Shakespeare, that he's out there cut out in tiny little stars, and that at any point in our lives, it doesn't matter whether we're celebrating, it doesn't matter whether we're grieving, we can always find something in Shakespeare's words to help us with those really key moments in our lives. So I hope you've enjoyed that. And if you've got any questions, do give us a wave.